tomatoes and just about every other type of produce that you can imagine that's imported from outside the United States is costing more every single year.
Ending a trade agreement, American farmers claim failed to keep underpriced Mexican imports from flooding the market.
Products to cost you more. That's because of a new 21% tax on tomato imports from Mexico starting today.
And we're likely to see the consumer anywhere from 10 to 15 cents more per pound of fresh tomatoes that you buy.
Growers nationwide were shocked by the collapse of U.S. tomato shipments to overseas markets. After bragging about their power to control store shelves overseas, American exporters discovered that their goods were being rejected at the border. Customers who had previously depended on consistent supplies of tomatoes from Florida, California, and Arizona started to voice worries about supply fluctuations, pesticide residues, and quality standards. These cargoes' rejection was not a single instance. Rather,
products to cost you more. That's because of a new 21% tax on tomato imports from Mexico starting today.
And announcing a 17% tariff this month on tomatoes from Mexico.
This was put into place by the Trump administration. According to the Associated Press, Mexico supplies roughly 70% of the tomatoes we eat here.
It was a contributing factor in the growing annoyance of foreign customers who perceived more reliable value elsewhere. The U.S. tomato industry's incapacity to contend with the growing dominance of Mexico's premium tomato sector was exposed by the loss of contracts and partnerships. Mexico, a longtime rival in the world market for agricultural products, jumped at the chance almost immediately.
And just about every other type of produce that you can imagine that's imported from outside the United States is costing more every single year.
Ending a trade agreement, American farmers claim failed to keep underpriced Mexican imports from flooding the market.
It comes as the Trump administration cut a nearly 30-year trade deal with Mexican-grown produce.
As American growers grappled with increasingly stringent laws, increased labor expenses, and fluctuating yields, Mexican producers had been making consistent investments in technology and infrastructure. The outcome was a new class of high-quality tomatoes that were produced in greenhouses, were pesticide-free, and had a uniformity that made them appealing to consumers in the Middle East, Europe, and Asia.
Not only is a roughly 21% tax on tomatoes expected to take effect today.
Here, I think a lot of Americans see this headline and just immediately think we have to pay 17% more for tomatoes.
But that number could reach 30% after yet another tariff threatened by the Trump administration.
Mexican supplies were greeted with open arms as American shipments were sent home or sat idle at ports, resulting in billion-dollar agreements that further solidified Mexico's hegemony in the fresh produce market. The impact to American farmers was not only monetary, it also damaged their reputation. As news broke about rejected cargoes, years of establishing networks with foreign retailers were put in jeopardy. Retailers started making public their move to Mexican suppliers, particularly in places like South Korea and Japan, where customer trust is crucial.
If a new deal isn't reached between the U.S. and Mexico by August 1st.
Like, for the price that we were selling tomatoes for last week is actually a little bit higher than this week.
He says there are pros and cons to be considered.
We're the fourth largest producer in the world.
The rejection of U.S. tomatoes turned into a PR nightmare in Europe, where more stringent food regulations are in place. Customers were informed that the shipments did not adhere to fundamental safety or freshness standards. Mexican suppliers, on the other hand, promoted their produce as being better in terms of transparency and taste, emphasizing sustainable practices and traceable farming methods in their advertising efforts.
We're actually bigger than Mexico, and there's the possibility that we can still produce a lot of tomatoes domestically.
When you have other states that start to come in for the summertime, there's more product available.
And we're likely to see the consumer anywhere from 10 to 15 cents more per pound of fresh tomatoes that you buy.
Mexico's investment in controlled environment agriculture was the main source of its advantage. Mexican producers invested substantially in enormous greenhouse complexes that span Sinaloa, Jalisco, and Baja California, whereas American farms continue to mainly rely on open fields that are susceptible to weather fluctuations. Year-round production, reliable grading, and exact input control were made possible by these facilities. Customers observed a greater range of specialty tomatoes: Roma, cherry, heirloom, and vine-ripened.
Our main thing is we just need to be put first in line. We need our tomatoes to go to the shelves on the grocery stores in our local neighborhoods.
Hirschbein says in 1996, Mexico and the United States got together to create a price range for tomatoes that was meant to protect U.S. growers.
All cultivated according to exacting standards, as well as fewer flaws and longer shelf lives. Mexico established itself as the leading provider in a market that is becoming more and more influenced by consumer preferences for sustainability and beauty. The billion-dollar agreements were also influenced by Mexico's assertive trade policy. To court overseas markets, exporters collaborated closely with government representatives and agricultural cooperatives. Whole pavilions at European trade events were devoted to Mexican products, telling the tales of the growers.
And this is something that's been going on for a long time, that the Mexico tomato industry has been on the extreme incline.
Unfortunately, that price range hasn't always been kept up to the current date of today's trade market.
And the American farmers have been on the decline. And it's a real national security problem with all types of produce. And
the areas where the tomatoes were produced in addition to the tomatoes themselves. Tasting parties and collaborations with upscale supermarkets in Asia brought attention to the flavor of Mexican tomatoes, frequently comparing them with erratic American goods. Instead of competing only on volume, Mexico was able to acquire higher price points by marketing their exports as premium.
It's just time that we get put first in line and allow, some help on that. There's a lot of people, even if they didn't buy, they were looking for outlets for even the next season or in the future.
I was reading that in just the first couple days that this went into effect, your phone blew up from customers.
For American growers, the irony was that they had invented many of the farming methods that Mexico was now perfecting. Decades earlier, American farmers and colleges had promoted precision irrigation, hydroponics, and greenhouse growth. However, many U.S. growers did not reinvest at the scale required to stay competitive as profit margins narrowed and land costs increased. These technologies were embraced and widely used in Mexico due to its cheaper labor costs and encouraging government initiatives. Now, Mexican tomatoes were exploding into profitable worldwide markets because to the very inventions that started north of the border. There are serious repercussions for American agriculture. Rejected shipments damage trust in addition to causing a short-term financial loss. The likelihood of a supermarket chain in London or Dubai switching back to U.S. imports decreases after they establish a dependable logistical network and move to a Mexican supplier. Reliability is important to buyers, and even a few high-profile rejections might give the impression that American tomatoes are not worth the risk. It is difficult for U.S. growers to regain confidence in a trade market where impress